So I'm starting with another short video to wrap up our recordings for day 2 of History 268. The first one I tried to trim to cut down. I had to take a quick break, and I hopefully trimmed that correctly so you could see about a 22-minute video introducing some key concepts from the introduction of Chastain's book, Born in Blood and Fire, and talking about the history of civilizations of the Americas, of Iberia, and of Africa on the eve of conquest. Um, Next week we will cover the conquest of the Americas in more detail, including the conquest of Tenochtitlan. You can see the first ever map of the city of Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire, here. We'll cover this in more detail after we read the article by Camilla Townsend, Burying the White Gods, which is for next Monday's class. But for this week, we're focusing mainly on the conceptual framework and a broad overview of all this material that John Charles Chastain is presenting to us in the introduction and first chapter of his book, Born in Blood and Fire. So with that in mind, going back to this opening slide on some key questions, I wanted to review a couple of things we haven't quite arrived at yet. First of all, Chastain's definition of liberalism, and then we've covered, of course, these two questions, I think, pretty clearly in the first part of the video for today. But the last question also, what is essential to understanding the history of relations between the U.S. and Latin America, and to how we think about the history of Latin America more broadly as well. So first of all, Chastain defines liberalism. He says that liberalism changed the traditional social institutions imposed upon the enslaved indigenous Americans and Africans, really shortly after conquest, and with the rise of the Enlightenment in particular. This notion of classical liberalism really is defined as a product of the Enlightenment, especially notions of popular sovereignty, questioning the divine right of authority and rule of monarchs, and notions of free trade and commerce are central components of classical liberalism. For Chastain, he says, liberalism, quote, comprises the core principles of the U.S. Constitution, principles shared by Republicans and Democrats alike, although that is increasingly coming into question in the present moment with the rise of fascism in the U.S. That's an interesting aside we could talk about for an entire month, I suppose, but we'll come back to it later in the semester when we get more into the modern period. He argues that historically, liberalism is a complex of values and practices that developed in the 1600s and 1700s, largely in France and in England, although there was also an Enlightenment and the emergence of liberalism in Iberia as well, I should add, especially in the Constitution of Cadiz in the early 19th century that was, albeit brief, significant in terms of the intellectual history of Spain and Portugal. Of course, both 1776 and 1789 are landmark dates on world liberalism, with a focus on the American Revolution and the French Revolution. But I would add to this, kind of building on Chastain's framework here, that the Haitian Revolution of 1791 to 1803 was also a landmark date in liberalism and changing what we think about the Enlightenment. As we discussed in last week's class, liberalism was inherently contradictory. It was a paradox in that it promised these universal human rights, like the right to elect one's leaders, the right to individual freedoms and liberties, but it denied these rights in practice to the majority of the populations of the Americas, including all women and all people of color. So these were rights that, although they were proclaimed to be universal, were limited in practice to white propertied men. So at the same time, liberalism, at least in its written form, favored progress over tradition, reason over faith, universal over local values, and the free market over government control. Liberalism also advocated and advocates for equal citizenship over entrenched privilege and representative democracy over all other forms of government, end quote, from Chastain there. He goes on to point out the flip side of liberalism he describes as nationalism, which became liberalism's rough opposite. And he asks, how did this happen, right? This is one of the reasons I really like Chastain's writing, and I like this textbook, um, is kind of how clear he allows you to follow his train of thought and think about historiography, which is a key term on this slide, by the way. Historiography refers to the history of history, right? How historians have changed over time and how we think about a particular area's history, in this case, Latin American history. Um, so he points out that nationalism, of course, rose in Europe under the forms of National Socialism and Fascism in the early 20th century. But in Latin America, the emphasis was on sovereignty and freedom from foreign domination. It also sought to bring together people of different backgrounds around ideas of national exceptionalism. The idea that, in contrast to the US and Latin America, Latin American nations successfully came together through mestizaje, or racial mixing, as we talked about last week, and shared ideas. This led to pointing up glorious indigenous pasts, like glorifying the history of the Inca or the Aztec or the Maya empires, while lamenting their contemporary backwardness or degradation, which in and of itself was also contradictory in that, as we'll see later in the semester when we look at intellectual and social movements like indigenismo, these were really led by white elites or Creole elites in Latin America that professed to respect and celebrate indigenous culture and history in their respective nation states as key components of their national identities, while at the same time kind of lamenting the fact that their contemporary indigenous populations they thought were behind and uneducated and in some ways culturally inferior. So it was inherently contradictory in all these really complex ways that we'll see over the course of the semester, especially when we get to the 1920s and 1930s and look at indigenismo as a form of nationalism. So the other key question I wanted to get to today, if I jump ahead a bit here, I'm also working with kids at home here, so my apologies. We'll look more at the conquest of Peru, of the Inca Empire, next Monday. But this gives you, as I was talking about the large expanse of territory the Incas had come to dominate, this map really, I think, puts it in an interesting imagery, right? A great way of kind of envisioning just how massive this empire was, stretching, again, from Chile all the way up through, what to say, the capital of Ecuador, through all of Bolivia, which is actually born here, in Peru. But jumping ahead then. A key answer to this question of what is essential to understanding the history of Latin America and the history of U.S.-Latin American relations, we have to look at both historiography and the Black legend. So this helps connect the history of encounter and conquest to historiography, I think, when we look at the so-called Black legend. Because, again, when we think about the logic of conquest itself, we look at the example of Santiago Matamoros, this mythic figure who's celebrated as an image of national cohesion in Spain, even though Spain didn't really come together as a nation state until much later in the 18th century. That famous painting of Santiago Matamoros lobbing the heads off of Moros in northern Iberia has become something of an emblem of national identity and national Catholicism in Iberia, especially in Galicia, northwestern Iberia. Although there's a lot of complexities to that I'm not getting into. That led to a certain logic of conquest and this belief that for the explorers coming from Iberia and traveling to the Americas in the early 16th century, they used Santiago Matamoros as a frame of reference to support the belief that their God was physically and materially on their side and had materially intervened on their behalf and therefore was in support of what the Catholics believed were just wars against non-Christians, right? So The fact that they were carrying out acts of violence, which seemed to be counter to some religious theology, right, and philosophy against their own Bible, was justified in the sense that they were carrying out these acts against non-believers, non-Christians who had been exposed to Catholicism and had decided to reject it, and therefore they believed these were acts of just war, and that those who were captured and defeated in these religious battles could be justifiably enslaved, right, or killed, right. And this same logic of conquest then played out with the arrival of Columbus in the Americas and subsequently um, in early Spanish colonization in the Caribbean that would follow in the conquests of Tenochtitlan and of the Mayas and of the Incas further south. But early on, when the Spanish were just arriving in the Caribbean, a friar named Bartolomé de las Casas was ordained a priest in the island of Hispaniola, the island where one of the first islands on which Columbus arrived, and which he named Hispaniola, which means basically Spanish, in which today is divided between the Dominican Republic, and Haiti, as you all now saw in your map quiz, right? You know that Haiti's on the western side, and Dominican Republic is on the eastern side of this island. Um, but this priest, Bartolomé de las Casas, came to witness the extreme violence and brutality of his compatriots from Iberia against the native populations based on this logic of conquest. Um, so he wrote a series of essays that then circulated throughout Iberia and the Spanish speaking world, um, in which he tried to lay bare these abuses by Spanish encomenderos, those who had gained an encomienda of a parcel of land and indigenous enslaved laborers to make that land productive on their behalf, right? And they were tasked with this word encomienda comes from the Spanish word encomender, which basically translates to entrust. So these encomenderos were entrusted with the lives of these native peoples, assuming that they would carry out their duty to allow them to convert to Christianity and teach them Catholic norms and traditions, right? But what Las Casas saw was that most of these encomenderos in the 16th century were ignoring their responsibilities and duties um, of converting natives to Christianity, but rather were seeking their own spoils of war for their own economic interests, and enslaving people and killing them really brutally without giving them a chance to convert. So this led to a great deal of debate in Iberia about the so-called capacity for native peoples to convert and understand Catholicism, and therefore their capacity to be fully human. So the question that was debated in Iberia throughout much of the 16th century was the humanity of the indigenous populations, asking whether or not they could be considered fully human or not. And of course, for Las Casas, the answer was, of course, yes. And he even advocated for the replacement of indigenous enslaved labor with African enslaved labor, which would lead to the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade. According to most records, he eventually recanted on this option, right, of African enslaved labor, recognizing that it was just as brutal as what the early encomenderos were doing. But his records have been maintained fairly well, and they were published in a single volume in 1552 in an account called A Brief Account of the Destruction of the Indies, which, of course, again, laid bare the brutality of the Spanish encomenderos and conquistadors against native populations, especially the Taino and Arawak people of the Caribbean. But he this led to what we now call the Black Legend. So this is these accounts were then picked up by English and Dutch intellectuals and subsequent historians to create a historical narrative that demonizes Spain, its people, and its culture in an intentional attempt to damage Spain's reputation. So this narrative of the Black Legend plays on the trope of the noble savage. It eschews empirical historical analysis in favor of limited sources and heavily influenced the early historiography of Latin America as a whole. It created persistent assumptions of backwardness and inferiority that also played into religious imperial differences of the 16th through the 18th centuries in these imperial rivalries between England, the Netherlands, Spain, and France. And so these narratives were really seized upon by the English and the Dutch um, to vilify the Spanish. And for that reason, they equated Catholicism with backwardness while promoting notions of Protestantism and equating that with the Protestant work ethic, especially in the United States. So this has come in many ways to kind of color U.S. understandings of Latin America. And if you pay attention now, you might see this emerging in kind of popular media in kind of subtle ways that the media in the U.S. depicts Latin America as inferior and backwards. In many ways, are reminiscent of the Black legend that dominated the early historiography. So, with that in mind, I want to turn to a broad overview of the historiography as Chasteen presents us. And again, this is a history of history, essentially, right? It's an overview that I think is really helpful before we dive into this material in too much detail to understand how we're approaching this history of Latin America in the present moment and how different it is from how this history was covered long before, right? Um, so up until throughout much of the 19th century, before history was really considered a profession in and of itself, worthy of uh, a more objective approach. Much of the history of Latin America was steeped in racial and environmental determinism. Um, and these really go hand in hand in many ways. So, uh, racial determinism was simply a racist interpretation of Latin America's history that was, in many ways, shaped by the Black legend itself, claiming that Latin America was inferior and backwards because it was populated by people that the U.S. historians considered to be inferior. And this was clearly simply a racist approach by pointing out the fact that Latin America had imported more enslaved African people and that it was conquered by the Spanish and Portuguese. Um, and because they were more open to racial mixture in Latin America, this has led to racial degeneration. This was an actual pseudoscientific term of much of the 19th century into the early 20th century. Um, and this explained Latin America's quote unquote underdevelopment and its higher rates of poverty in contrast to the United States and in contrast to Europe, without really taking into account historical particularism um, or any different perspectives at all. And so this held sway until the 1930s, in part because of the rise of fascism in Europe. We see this kind of fall out of favor in the 1940s. It's replaced by modernization theory, which, as you can see, placed the blame on traditional social structures and backward mentalities. So we see this the maintenance of this notion of Catholic traditionalism and the lack of a Protestant work ethic still being used to justify and kind of explain away Latin American underdevelopment and higher rates of poverty there. We now know that both of these approaches are highly flawed, right? And they're steeped in prejudice, if not outright racism. In the 1960s, we see a major cultural and intellectual shift in the Western world, both in Europe and the United States, where, in part because of popular protest against a perceived U.S. imperialism in the Vietnam War and the ongoing wars of decolonization in Africa, we see Marxist interpretations of world history coming to the fore and having some dominance, both in cultural and academic settings. This leads to the rise of what scholars have come to call dependency theory. The notion, to summarize this really succinctly, it's the notion that Latin American countries are in a state of permanent dependence vis-a-vis the global north, and in particular the United States. So it asserts that because of the history of colonization and imperialism and even neo-colonization, as it came to be called in the 60s as well, that the only way for Latin America to overcome the situation was through a violent Marxist revolution. Um, and perhaps the prime example of this would be the Cuban Revolution of 1959, in which, of course, Castro and Guevara overthrow a U.S. supported dictator, Fulgencio Batista, in 1959, and initiate a communist state, right, that essentially is still in place into the present day. Um, so this interpretation placed all of the blame for Latin American underdevelopment and poverty on the United States and on Europe, vis-a-vis in its relationship with Africa in particular and in Southeast Asia. Excuse me. But historians came to see major problems with this approach as well, in that it overlooked historical particularism of these different regions and of different nation states in Latin America. And it also simply ignored the agency or ability of people in the global south to make decisions for themselves. Broadly speaking, it also overlooked the roles of elite minorities in each of the countries of Latin America and working with imperial powers of the global north to benefit themselves at the expense of the vast majority of their local populations. This is something we'll have to come back and talk a bit more about in a discussion format, because it's one thing for me to explain it as best I can in a recording, but it's hard for me to gauge if you're really following my train of thought here. Both this process of the historiography and its flaws, right? So in the 1980s, we begin to see a major turn in higher education throughout the U.S., promoted primarily by linguists, cultural scholars, cultural theorists, and anthropologists. We come to call this the post-structuralist or linguistic turn in the humanities, where scholars came to recognize how language is both arbitrary but also reflects power dynamics, and in doing so, it constructs and reifies social realities, especially regarding gender and race. Um, so anthropologists and linguists came to recognize the relationship between language and power, um, and they push scholars to recognize this in our own research, and have pushed then for more culturally relative approaches. As I've integrated in all of my classes in one way or another, the way that I've integrated this in my own teaching and research is recognizing how similar these early civilizations were on the eve of conquest and encounter, as we've already covered, right? Rather than simply state, well, the Europeans were more advanced in these ways. And actually, when we look back at the records and the available evidence, what we see emerge are way more similarities than differences between these different civilizations, right? So by taking more of an anthropological approach and an empirical approach to the historical record, we come to see things through a more relative lens, through what many would come to call cultural relativism, in which we accept the validity of differing understandings of cosmology, of religion, and society in all these different cultures, rather than hold one up as more advanced than the other, and kind of a teleological process that was destined to occur the way that it did. When we look more at the history of the conquest next week, this will become more apparent. We look at just how lucky, essentially, the Iberians were upon their arrival to the Americas, and as well as with their interactions with West African kingdoms in their timing, right? When, as we'll see next Monday, when Cortez arrived on the east coast of what is today Mexico, he was extremely fortunate to meet a translator and an interpreter named Malinche, who was quick to guide him towards the Aztec capital at Tenochtitlan in order to exact revenge on the traditional enemies of their tributary states that surrounded Tenochtitlan, because of the long history of flower wars that the Aztec Empire had carried out. And later, in the conquest of the Inca Empire, Pizarro was quite fortunate to arrive in the midst of a civil war, which provided a major opening for him to find local allies to do most of the fighting for him in the conquest of the Inca Empire, first at Cajamarca and later at Cusco. And then with the establishment of Lima, this allowed them to put down the Great Inca Rebellion in 1536 as well. So This is a quick summary of our understanding of how our understanding of the history of Latin America has developed over time and improved. But surely there's still room for improvement, as we'll see over the course of the semester. Um, but the last point I wanted to get to here is uh, Chastain's analysis of the so-called colonial legacy. And he says the colonial legacy lies in its original sin, right? He says, quote, the original sin lay in the logic justified in religious terms that assumed a right to conquer and colonize, end quote. This led to the Spanish Inquisition that was established back in Iberia to impose religious purity, particularly on conversos and new Christians. And next week we'll look at the conquest itself in more detail, and especially in the article Burying the White Gods for next Monday's class. And I'll provide a much more detailed overview of the conquest then. But this is setting us up to understand how our understanding of the history of Latin America has improved over time, although there's still room for improvement. So we'll end here. I hope that this video series is helpful for you all to stay on track. And please keep up with the readings. So for this week, the next reading is chapter 1 of the Chastine text. And for next week, next Monday, I'm assigning a reading called Burying the White Gods, New Perspectives on the Conquest of Mexico by Camilla Townsend, and that you'll find that on Blackboard for next Monday's class. Thank you all for your flexibility this week and keeping up with the material despite a rather difficult situation with the weather. Hope you all are staying healthy and safe, and look forward to seeing you all in person again very soon. Take care. Fuck. Inquisition or the Spanish Inquisition. Shit. let it go.